Hi friends, Rick Edwards here. Thank you for joining me again for another lesson from the Gospel Project. Today's video is actually not a lesson video, but rather it's what we call a contextual video. And the purpose of this video is simply to help provide some broader contextualization for the lesson of what's going on in the bigger story, in the bigger narrative of the Old Testament and the Bible itself. And then that will help you understand what's happening in each individual lesson. So today we're going to be talking about David and Solomon, because I want you to see how there's a relationship between what happened to each of them and how what God was attempting to do and what God was doing through them and through their experiences helped set what was going to be happening throughout Israel's history and actually sets a context for even the coming of Jesus in the New Testament. So we're talking about David and Solomon. Now, what I want to point out is that both of them experienced an encounter with God, a significant encounter with God that was then followed by a season of really great success and blessing on their kingdom, on their rule, and on the nation of Israel. Then that was followed by a significant spiritual failure. Okay? Both of them went through the same pattern. Encounter with God, success, failure. Now, as a reminder, we go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7 through 12, 6 chapters, and in those 6 chapters we see how David encountered God in chapter 7 when he asked Nathan the prophet, "Can I build a temple for God?" And initially Nathan said yes, but then God came back through Nathan and said, "Actually, you're not going to be the one to build the temple. Rather, you're not going to build me a house. I'm going to build you a house." And it's in 2 Samuel 7 that God establishes what we call the Davidic covenant. It's where God makes a promise to David that he is going to make certain that one of David's successors, one of his offspring, will always be on the throne for Judah, for Israel. Okay? It's what we call the Davidic covenant. It's a very significant passage in the Old Testament story. Now, that is then followed by 2 or 3 chapters where David experiences this fantastic success. Things are going great. Things are going great in Israel. It's really a significant high point for Israel in these chapters. But then we come down to chapter 11. And it's in chapter 11 that David commits adultery with Bathsheba and then attempts to cover it up by having her husband Uriah murdered. And things go downhill after that for David's kingdom. Very significant. But that pattern of encounter with God, followed by success, followed by failure, spiritual failure, all takes place in the course of 6 chapters. Now, let's move forward a little bit to Solomon's reign. 1 Kings chapter 6, chapter 6 through 11. Here, Solomon also encounters has a significant encounter with God. And you'll recall it's in chapter 6 that he's building the temple, as God said he would be able to do. He's building the temple. It's in chapter 8 that he dedicates the temple. And it's in that context of the dedication of the temple that God comes down and fills the temple. There's smoke, pyrotechnics. It's great, very dramatic, all kinds of stuff. Solomon has a very significant encounter with God. He prays, God responds. It's really a wonderful time for Solomon. That is then followed by a season of enormous success for Solomon and success for Israel. Israel becomes one of the greatest nations in the world, perhaps the greatest nation in the world at that time. Then we get down to chapter 11 and we discover that Solomon has taken on wives who turn his heart away from God, and Solomon falls into a season of idolatry. And ultimately, God must judge Solomon and his family, and the kingdom because of Solomon's spiritual failure. So both Solomon and David followed the same pattern of an encounter with God, followed by great success, followed by spiritual failure. Okay? So keep that in mind. It's a similar pattern, and it's intentional. The author wants us to see this pattern. Now, when you step back and look at the monarchy as a whole, when you step back and look at Israel's Old Testament history as a whole, what we're going to see is that collectively, these two reigns, these two kings, David and Solomon, collectively, this season, roughly 80 years of their two reigns together, was the high point in Israel's Old Testament history. You might even argue that perhaps that season was the high point in all of Israel's history, even to today. Extreme blessing, extreme fortune coming on Israel during this time. Collectively, those two things represent perhaps the greatest point in Israel's history of any time. But these two events, these two significant times here that take place, point to two very important things. In David's case, the Davidic covenant points to God's purpose. The Davidic covenant was about God's promise to ultimately accomplish what he said he was going to do, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, speaking to Adam and Eve following their sin. I'm going to send a Messiah. I'm going to send a seed, someone who's going to fix things. Then coming down to Genesis chapter 12, Abraham's call. He says, Abraham, through you, I'm going to bless the entire earth. All people will be blessed through you. So throughout Israel's history, and we could go on, throughout Israel's history, God had called them to be a blessing, called them to be an instrument through whom he would ultimately accomplish his purposes to bless the people of the world and to fix things that had gone wrong in light of Adam and Eve's sin. So the Davidic covenant demonstrates to us that God intends to bring the Messiah through David's lineage. It's very clear when you read chapter 7, 2 Samuel 7, that the Davidic covenant isn't just about the kings to follow in the Old Testament history. It's really looking forward. The Davidic covenant looks forward to another king coming someday, and we know that king to be Jesus, okay? But it's all about the purpose of God, God's purpose, and how he is seeking to accomplish what he wants to do and has wanted to do all along. Now, for Solomon, there's a little bit different emphasis. In Solomon's case, when you read the story, when you especially read about the dedication of the temple in chapter 8, but even outside of that, you get the clear impression that Solomon's experience is not so much about God's purpose as it is about God's presence. And that's apparent as you read the dedication of the temple. Once they move the Ark of the Covenant in, smoke fills, and God says repeatedly to Solomon, I will be here. I will be present within and among your people. Very significant. So, on the one hand, David's experience points to God's purpose. Solomon's experience points to God's presence. Two very important things. And when we step back, we begin to understand in the large picture of the Old Testament monarchy, starting with Saul, then David and Solomon, and then all the kings that followed. And by the way, after Solomon, it basically all goes downhill. The nation splits. There's never again a unified kingdom. So all these things happen. When we step back, we realize that this was a high point. And it's due to the fact that God's purpose is being fulfilled. These kings are living, David and Solomon are living under God's purpose, and they're living under God's presence. It's these two things that make the nation's success possible. And that is still going to be true. We need to understand that in our own lives and in our churches. It's God's purpose, living under God's purpose, and then living under God's presence. Bottom line here, a couple of things I want to note. When you see this, when you step back and look at this, you're going to see in these two kings, this season of roughly 80 years, David, Solomon, one thing we can see is that God is going to accomplish his purposes in spite of human failure. God is going to accomplish what he wants to accomplish through Israel, through these kings, through his plan. God is going to do what he wants to do, even through flawed kings. And the text makes it clear. David was flawed. Solomon is flawed. So, even in spite of their failures, God will accomplish his purposes. That's an important lesson for us to learn. I also want to point this out. By the time you get to the end of 2 Kings, now remember, at this point, we're still early in the book of 1 Kings, but if you go to the end, remember, 1 and 2 Kings were originally one book. So you get to the end of 2 Kings, there's going to be an inescapable conclusion that we reach. Then when you get to the end of 2 Kings, the people are in Babylon. The people have been carried away. Jerusalem and the temple have been destroyed. For all practical purposes, Jerusalem is gone. And for all practical purposes, the people are now in exile. They are no longer in the promised land. They are in Babylon. So when you get to the end of 2 Kings, the inescapable conclusion you reach when you get there is that we need a different kind of king. All of the kings, there's this long line of kings, starting with David and Solomon, but then king after king after king. Some were better than others. David was always considered a great model for how kings should be, but as we see and have seen, David himself failed, Solomon failed, and for all practical purposes, every king after them failed, so that when you get to the end of 2 Kings, you have to conclude Israel, or now we, need a different kind of king. The answer, the solution, is not in a political or military king or kingdom. We need a different kind of king ruling over a different kind of kingdom. And we know as New Testament Christians that Jesus is and became and is that king for us. We now live with a different kind of king and we live in a different kind of kingdom. Very important lesson that we need to learn as we think about David and Solomon. Thanks for listening.